bringing you the stories behind the standards. This is the BSI Education Podcast with Matthew Childs, Alan Sellers, and Cindy Parakill. Today's episode is on the future of standards.
Nowadays, basically, the way that standards are used is quite different from how it was 20 or 30 years ago. They're no longer a document that you kind of file away on a shelf and forget about, or occasionally go off and refer to and scribble on, go round to a design desk and make sure that someone's being compliant, tick it off on a piece of paper and then go back. So the way that standards are actually used is increasingly in software. We need to make sure that standards can easily be transferred into a machine-readable format so that you can get standards into requirements management software or into your CAD program or into your BIM model or into your automation system. This is what we now refer to as smart standards.
Hello, my name is Matthew Childs and I am with Alan Sellers.
Hello, Matthew.
And I'm also with Cindy Parakill.
Hi, Matthew.
Now, today's episode is all about the future of standards. The voice you heard at the top of the episode was from one of our guests today, Ivan Salcedo, talking about his work in the development of smart standards. As well as Ivan, you'll also hear from Katherine Hunter talking about BSI Flex, a new type of standard designed to keep pace with innovations and fast-developing technologies. Both Ivan and Katherine set out some of the changes underway for how standards are made, updated and used out in the real world. And just as interestingly, they tell us about some of the important elements of standards making that will not be changing.
It was great to learn about how the standards making process is evolving to reflect the dynamic and iterative nature of innovation. Specifically, that BSI Flex was a result of trying to find a process that marries up rapid speed of technological change with the core principles of standards development. That was really interesting. I liked how Katherine broke down the circumstances or criteria in which ISO standards, PASs, and BSI Flex are most suited. That really helped to put things into perspective.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned PASs there, Cindy. For a bit more information on what a PAS is, check out episode 12 of the podcast, where we shine a spotlight on PAS 440 for responsible innovation. And don't forget, if there's a standard on which you'd like us to shine a spotlight, then just drop us an email at education@bsigroup.com. Now, before we move on, I just want to mention one of Ivan's comments. In my chat with him, he talks about being a complexity vortex. Now, you'll have to listen to our conversation to understand what he means by that. But for some reason, that comment made me think of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, which was a BBC radio series first broadcast in 1978, which became a book and then a TV series and eventually a rather disappointing Hollywood film. Now, I said that Complexity Vortex reminded me of the Total Improbability Drive, which powered Zaphod Beeblebrox's spaceship with a heart of gold. Now, it turns out what I meant to say was the Infinite Improbability Drive.
I think, Matthew, that you were thinking there of the Total Perspective Vortex. Now, I'm going to read from the guide itself. It is in theory possible to extrapolate the whole of creation, every galaxy, every sun, every planet, their orbits, their composition and their economic and social history from, say, one small piece of fairy cake. The machine was originally created by its inventor, Trin Tragula, as a way to get back at his wife. She was always telling him to get a sense of proportion, so he showed her the vortex. Tragula was horrified to learn he had destroyed her mind, even as he proved his point, that if life was going to live in such a vast universe, one thing it could not afford to have was a sense of perspective.
I absolutely have no idea what you two are talking about.
Alan, thank you. You're absolutely right. You've completely put me straight there. Now, I think the perspective I've gained here is that discovering that maybe I'm not as big a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide as I thought I was, or maybe I'm just getting to that stage when I just start forgetting things. But actually, there is there is one standards link to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which he says getting out his metaphorical crowbar.
Here he goes again, Cindy.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Alan, as you know, being a fan, because clearly you are, the main character of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one Arthur Dent. Now, in one of the scenes, he sets the Heart of Gold's Nutramatic drinks dispenser the challenge of making him a cup of tea. Cue hilarious exchange between stereotypical Englishmen and a computer about boiling leaves and whether it's milk in first or second. Now, back in 2015, to coincide with International Tea Day that year, now this year it's the 21st of May, so pop that in your diaries, tea fans, BSI thought that they had definitively ruled on this most important of issues and published a set of guidelines on making the perfect cup of tea. So back in 2015, we said, if you want your tea with milk, the milk must be poured into the cup first before the tea is added. The temperature of the water mustn't exceed 85 degrees Celsius to ensure it doesn't scald the milk, but should be above 60 degrees Celsius for optimum flavour and sensation. Now, I'm a big tea drinker, and I'm glad to say I'm not just being on message here, but of course that's absolutely right. As any proper person knows, it's milk in first, obviously. Alan, Cindy, milk in first?
No milk for me.
Oh, radical, Cindy?
Milk in last for me, Matthew.
Have you listened to a single word I've just said?
I might just have to disagree with you there.
Well, I might have to channel my inner Jackie Weaver here and throw you off the podcast.
You have no authority here, Matthew Charles.
Now, guys, how's your week been? What have you both been up to? Cindy, have you been out running in that there lovely Vienna?
I have. So far, I've gotten in a run every day of the week. The weather has been piercing cold here in Vienna, but to my surprise, I enjoy running in this climate. I may even go as far as saying I prefer it to running in the warm weather. What about you, Matthew? What do you prefer?
Yeah, I'm a big runner too, and I'm a bit like you, actually. I prefer it when it's slightly cooler.
Yeah.
It's definitely easier to warm up than it is to cool down. It's very cold here and icy, so I haven't done much running in the past few days. But yeah, I'm with you. I think the cooler weather is better for running. Alan, how about you? How's your week been?
Yeah, we reached DEFCON 2 in our house after the smell of burning rubber and smoke began to pour from one of our kitchen appliances. In a home of 6, the tumble dryer is a piece of critical infrastructure, so it was a bit of a nightmare. We called up the guys that can come and fix these sorts of things, and apparently 125 quid on average to fix. But working in household appliances, I just couldn't let this go. So all that needed replacing was a £20 tumble dryer belt. So job done.
That's true. I think, as you say, as being an engineer and working in household appliances, I think that was a job you had to do yourself, wasn't it?
I kind of think I must have had to think about reorganising my priorities if I couldn't get that done. Anyway, what have you been up to this week, Matthew?
Well, as I say, it's been pretty cold and icy here. We had London snow, which means a light flurry, which means everything stops. But very, very cold. So I've been on the turbo trainer this week a bit more, trying to get some exercise in. Something actually I bought a couple of months before lockdown 1, which was lucky really, because if you tried to buy a turbo trainer during lockdown in March, you just couldn't get them. But I must say it's been an absolute lifesaver for us. There's 3 of us in the house that can use it. So Child B is a bit too small, can't quite reach the pedals. But Child A definitely can. So 3 of us have been taking advantage of the turbo trainer. But because of that, you sometimes have to book or queue in order to get a place.
I know that problem quite too well.
So that's great. So that's enough about our week then, really. How about, I think it's probably worth mentioning at this point, some of our upcoming episodes we're working on. Alan, what have you been working on?
I've been working on the topic of conformity assessment. It's when standards really come to life in an area of standardisation I'm quite interested in.
Yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to that one. We trailed that a couple of times, and that will be great when we finally publish that episode. Cindy, how about you?
I'm working on 2 exciting episodes, actually covering the international perspective again. One on the Commonwealth Standards Network program, which is a UK government-funded program, and a second one on the role of international standards to support the transition to a digital economy. So very excited about those 2.
Those sound great. And from my side, I'm working on a consumers and standards mini-series with colleagues from CPIN, which is the Consumer and Public Interest Network here at BSI. So look out for those upcoming episodes. So we should probably crack on. Alan, do you have a standards desk of news for us?
I do indeed, Matthew. The headlines this week: ME for MPEG and Building Safety Competence of Individuals. The big news this week is the Joint Technical Committee of ISO and IEC has done it again and has been awarded another Technology and Engineering Emmy. The US-based National Academy of Television, Arts and Sciences presents Emmy Awards for excellence in artistic, educational and technical achievements in television. The Emmy was awarded to the Moving Pictures Expert Group, or MPEG, for the development of ISO/IEC 14496-12. That's the ISO-based media file format. This file format is designed to contain time media information for presentation in a format that facilitates interchange, management, editing, and presentation of the media. So what does that mean for us? Well, if you've been binging box sets during the pandemic, you'll have certainly been relying on the Moving Pictures experts and their file formats because they underpin all the major streaming platforms. Watch this space because the Moving Pictures guys have set their sights on genomes and MPEG-G, a new open standard for genomic information representation. So, is expected to aid significantly the storage, transmission, and importantly, the processing of raw sequencing data that's used in genomes. Next up, the commenting period on BSI Flex 8670 overarching framework for building safety competence of individuals has just closed with over 800 comments received on the second version of this Flex standard. As we'll be hearing from Katherine Hunter later in this episode, Flex standards rapidly iterate through versions in response to open consultation. New versions can be created in a few weeks, so keep an eye out for version 3 coming soon. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Alan. And as always, you can find the links to those stories in the episode notes. Here's me with a quick reminder that for more information on BSI Education, go to bsigroup.com/education. This link and others on the themes raised in this episode can be found in the episode notes. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts and share us on social media using the hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or ideas for future episodes, then do please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We really welcome your feedback. Now, the aim of this podcast is to bring you the stories behind the standards. And today's story is all about the future of standards, which we explore with our guests Ivan Salcedo and Katherine Hunter. Katherine works in BSI's Standard Services team and was involved in the development of BSI's new approach to standards development, BSI Flex. Her background is in sustainability, and she worked in B2B publishing before joining BSI to develop our portfolio of sustainability standards. Ivan describes himself as working at the intersection between technology, strategy and policy to help BSI navigate and shape the future of standards both nationally and internationally. As you'll hear, he talks passionately about the power of digital technologies to deliver economic and social good, and the important role that standards have in improving productivity, sustainability and resilience. Ivan has held a number of innovation, product and management roles in different types of publishers and has been developing digital solutions for over 25 years. He currently leads BSI's input into the Smart Standards programme and represents BSI on numerous groups related to digital standards and open source standards at CEN, CENELEC, ISO and the IEC. We hear from Ivan first and then Katherine. But before that, here's a quick guide to the normal way standards are made.
A standard starts with an idea. Anyone can suggest an idea for a new standard. Every idea is assessed, and stakeholders are consulted to see if there's a need for the standard. Next, a stakeholder group is formed to take the approved idea forward. Then the stakeholder group forms a committee or a drafting panel. The draft standard is circulated for public comment. The comments are considered, and the committee or the drafting panel prepares an updated draft. After final approval by stakeholders, the standard is published. Standards are reviewed every 2 to 5 years. The committee or the drafting panel considers any comments received and decides if the standard should be reconfirmed, amended, revised, or withdrawn. A decision to amend or revise leads to a new proposal, and the cycle begins again.
Now, Ivan, I introduced you there as someone who works at the intersection between technology, strategy and policy to help BSI navigate and shape the future of standards both nationally and internationally. Can you tell us a bit more about that role?
What it means is that I'm a complexity vortex. So I attract problems to me and try and find a way to navigate through that complexity on behalf of BSI and hopefully the entire standards ecosystem. In more kind of sensible terms, what it means is that I bring experience in a number of different fields from, I've been a developer, I've been an editor, I've worked in marketing, and I have worked a lot in strategy, particularly IT strategy. So I bring these skills together to look at what is a wicked problem in the jargon, but is actually a very kind of convoluted way of saying that standards are hard to change.
I don't think we've had we definitely haven't had anyone so far describe themselves as a complexity vortex. So I think you stand alone there. But that reminds me of the Hitchhiker's Guide in Probability Drive. So it sounds very reminiscent of that. Now, you mentioned there, Ivan, a number of different roles that you've had in your career. I just wondered what's been your standards journey. Often our guests talk about either being sort of steeped in standards or seduced by standards. How did you get to this point?
My career owes its existence to standards. So there are two things that are critical to my career. One is standards, particularly those developed by W3C. I've worked in digital most of my professional life. And the second is open source. So the open availability of standards and tools and information to create these digital products. So, but I have to confess, I wasn't really aware of standards, and particularly formal standards, until relatively late on. I was working as a corporate communications person, kind of producing websites and editing. And I got to do the BSI proofreading standard as an evening course. And that's the very first time I remember coming into contact with BSI. And then very quickly, because I am a complexity vortex, I got sucked into standards world to the extent where I now actually sit on a committee making standards, and I organize some of my work as if I was making a standard. So I think I have been seduced by standards over time.
I think we should add to this. I mean, sucked in by standards. That's a good one too. Just W3C. Can you explain that?
So the organisation that looks after web standards, or did to begin with. So there are a consortia of technology professionals similar to the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and other such entities. They were originally responsible for HTML and CSS, so the language for markup and presentation on the web. And Most of my early career was spent kind of grappling with companies who were not quite adhering to those standards. And it's an easy thing for people to kind of be very blasé about nowadays. But in the days of dial-up modems and very simple internet browsers, it was absolutely critical to have compliant pages if you wanted anyone to read things at all. As I once discovered when people started printing off things that I'd put on our corporate website. And if you put white text onto a coloured background in those days, it would simply print out white paper.
Now, before our conversation, we played in a quick summary of how standards are made. So from submitting an idea, forming a stakeholder group, drafting, public consultation, and so on, with the process ending up with a published document. Now, in terms of the history of this approach, I'm guessing that these fundamentals haven't really altered that much over the past 120 years.
No, they haven't, and for good reason. So best practice and the agreement around best practice is a bit of an art form, but it can be boiled down to a process, and it has developed slowly and been improved generically over a number of years. I normally do kind of a little prop show and tell at the moment. So what I often do is kind of hold up the first standard I can get hold of, which we still have in our catalogue, which is from I think the 1920s, but it's in it's obviously on paper. It's in a paper format that no longer exists, with currencies that no longer exists. The catalogue will fit on an entire page, but the critical bit is that the content that's in that standard would be almost immediately understood today. So the content, the knowledge that is codified through standards would be understood and usable, frankly. And that's largely because the process, the quality that is introduced through standardization of that knowledge codification has not really changed over the years.
So if some of the things have stayed very similar, what are they? Obviously, we've invited you on today to talk about sort of the future of standards. What are the drivers for change now?
Well, put simply, it's the changing technology environment around us. So for those 120 years that standards have been produced in the UK, the dominant form has been a document. So for about 80 years, they were produced in print. Then we started to also produce them as what we used to call soft copy and hard copy. So that was the introduction of PDF. Slowly, we've been transitioning to PDF only. So very, very few of our standards are actually produced hard copy first now. It's done by exception usually. But nowadays, basically, the way that standards are used is quite different from how it was 20 or 30 years ago. So they're no longer a document that you kind of file away on a shelf and forget about, or occasionally go off and refer to and scribble on, go round to a design desk and make sure that someone's being compliant, tick it off on a piece of paper, and then go back. So the way that standards are actually used is increasingly in software. So we need to make sure that standards can easily be transferred into a machine-readable format, so that you can get standards into requirements management software, or into your CAD program, or into your BIM model, or into your automation system. This is what we now refer to as smart standards. So smart standards are standards that are machine applicable, readable, and transferable. And they will become the focus of a lot of activity over the next few years.
So I just wonder, what are there any other sort of market conditions that have changed significantly that this new way of developing standards is responding to?
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, technology adoption is the macro change, and that's commonly referred to as digital transformation, and that is happening through most industries at kind of different paces. But there are some specific industries, particularly those that are heavy users of standards, construction, automotive, aerospace, where historically productivity growth has not been consistent or has not been the same as for other industries. So the kind of main actors in these industries are keen to see how they can become more efficient, produce better quality outcomes, more secure, safer, and increasingly also that there are new pressures, things like personalization and customization. So the whole shape of manufacturing has altered pretty dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years, and that's playing through a number of different industries, from food to clothing to other forms of manufacturing. And ultimately, it's not just the factory, it's the supply chain. And then once you get into supply chain, you need to assure the supply chain and now the focus is a lot on kind of trust and can we prove where something came from? Is the material you're using genuine? And the very kind of cutting edge of standards at the moment is probably around ethics. So is this standard introducing or addressing bias in certain aspects of it, the way that it was tested, the perhaps even the shape of people that it is being aimed at, let alone kind of more subtle things around race, gender, etc. And all of this, at the end of the day, is driven by technology. So the ethics, a lot of the ethics thing is driven by the increased adoption of artificial intelligence throughout the supply chain. The supply chain is adopting artificial intelligence because it wants to be more productive. It needs to do better with more resources, be more sustainable, X, Y, Z. So you kind of have a virtuous cycle now that's driving change at ever increasing speed.
Ever wondered why certain standards are made, or who gets to make them? Why standards are numbered the way they are, and who gets to choose the numbers? Or maybe you have a burning question about standards related to your job or the sector in which you work? Well, this is your chance to ask the BSI Education Podcast, and we will get your questions answered. All you have to do is record your question via audio message and send it to education@bsigroup.com. We'll put the best ones to a panel of experts in a future episode, so stay tuned.
I just wonder then, you mentioned they're machine readable, and you mentioned there some sort of issues about how an organisation operates and improves. With this sort of new approach in mind, what difference will those changes make for organisations then about how they sort of consume the standard? What would it look like, and how will they experience it in terms of how it's being used within an organisation?
Well, we've done some ethnographic research on how people use standards. So that means that we've actually sent people out to kind of work with the people who actually use standards and see how they are. What happens once people have either downloaded or purchased them, and that may surprise some of your listeners that kind of this maybe isn't kind of common practice, but historically standards bodies have concerned themselves with the making process. So the rule set, the selection of committee members, the identification of subjects to look at, and then the generation of a good quality standard. So the publication is of a certain quality. So what happened after it left, we weren't really all that aware of. What we could do was kind of measure an overall economic benefit of standards to the entire economy. So to try and address that, we've gone into companies and looked at how they use them, and we've found that there's a typical kind of sequence of events that happens when customers look for standards and to solve their problems. So the first is they have a problem. So we're looking to understand user problems a little bit better. Then they have to discover what standards are applicable to that problem. So some of the areas around smart standards are to do with taxonomy management, are to do with identifiers and relationships. So how standards relate to each other, how they're classified, what problems they look to address, what actor should be using them. So that's the discovery phase. Then what happens after someone has got hold of a standard, typically the people who access them then don't use them directly. What happens is they go through an interpret stage, and in the interpretation stage, that this is typically performed by engineers or by subject matter experts. They will kind of decompose a standard. They will kind of say, do I understand the provisions that are within here? Are there forms of clarification that are required? What company policies or other standards do I need to understand what to do with on my problem? And in smart standards, that is about enriching it in various different ways. So that's about making it clear what is a requirement, what is a reference. Ideally, structuring those requirements in a better way so that they're more consistent with user needs, and also making it easier to cross-reference and perhaps pull together information from multiple standards at the same time. So that's an interpretation stage. Then people go through an adaptation phase, and in the adaptation phase, people take the kind of the raw input of the standard and then they put it into their own context. So that could mean that they're creating from a simple perspective, a spreadsheet of things that they need to do, or they could be putting it into a formal requirements management system, or plugging it into a CAD diagram BIM model, as I suggested earlier, running some software, putting some parameters in somewhere, or increasingly more kind of esoteric things like IoT sensors, putting a standard directly on there, and more and more often the challenge is going to be how do we translate it into a digital twin environment. So there's quite a lot of adaptation work, and a lot of the adaptation is about kind of formats and structures. So part of my work at the moment focuses a lot on how we allow for semantic interoperability of standards. So how does the content within a standard fit within a wider graph of other knowledge? There's two more phases that people still go through, that they then, so having found out what to do, they know that they've worked out what they need to do about it, they've then transferred it into their own application, they then need to use the standard. So the most obvious example of that is in certification activities or compliance activities, where it basically, you can formally apply the standard. But one of the main changes that we'll see through Smart is we expect to go more and more towards a continuous assessment type environment. So at the moment, compliance is often a point-in-time exercise. You might get visited once a year by an auditor, or it's something that if you do it on a voluntary basis, you might go around the factory once a month or whatever it is, whether it's a stock take or you're looking at a manufacturing line, or you might assess your new design, against some specification that you've got. But you typically only do that once or on a periodic cycle. Whereas a smart standard will enable you to do that on a kind of continuous basis, and also to potentially keep plugged in. So it's not kind of unreasonable to expect your design to know when a standard has been updated, rather than you have to tell it, I now need to update this specification to meet a new form of best practice. The best practice can actually alert you that kind of, hang on, this parameter has changed, or you should consider these other provisions that are now suggested. And over time, things get more and more sophisticated. Then the last thing where customers can expect change, and I think this is a big push for everyone, is about measurement. So one of the reasons that we've been fairly slow to change the way that standards are offered to end users is because we have a fairly weak market feedback. We haven't historically known how people use standards, or been able to help people understand, well, you're using this standard in this way, but these other people are using this standard in another way, except through the medium of kind of the compliance frameworks, which are often kind of focused on pretty specific areas of management. So what we hope through the introduction of smart standards, which is to kind of continue a digital thread where we can continually improve the standardization outcomes for end users by having these kind of feedback loops acting on a much quicker cycle. In standards terms, that is likely to end up with, it's not likely, it is already producing new forms of standardization, and I believe you're going to be talking about Flex later with Katherine. But that kind of cyclical regeneration is not the right word. That's I'm still going back to my science fiction introduction. The improvement, the continual improvement, there's a business word for you that's bland enough. The continual improvement of the standard is enabled through smart.
Well, you described there something that sounds extremely radical and transformative, and we started the conversation around the simple process ending up with a published document, which over the last 20, 30 years has become a PDF. But what you're describing there is something very, very different. Now, obviously, we talk on the podcast a lot about standards being an international game, and obviously the issues you've spoken about there are important to BSI as the national standards body and as a standards organisation. But obviously, we can't be the only part of the standards community that have an interest in this. So I just wonder, what are your our colleagues at European level, SEN and SENLEC, and an international level, ISO and the IEC in particular, how are they involved in these changes?
Well, it's interesting you say that, you asked that, Matthew, because your co-host, Alan, that's actually how I met Alan, is on an international group at the IEC.
He gets everywhere. He gets absolutely
He does everywhere. He does. So that's the international level, looking at the future of standards. And the interesting thing is kind of the different kind of people looking at change, but for slightly different reasons. So the IEC is dominated by big electrotechnical companies, big manufacturers. So they're very clued up, and they're very keen to change. At the ISO level, it's very much driven by committee members, and particularly those working in industrial automation and things like that. So people who are very familiar with technology and who have been working in systems and systems methodologies for a number of years. One of the interesting conversations I had and I talked to a lot of people about smart standards. I ended up talking to the outgoing chair of AMT4, which is the BSI representative to the industrial automation committees. And I was talking to him about this new concept that we were coming up with of machine readable standards. And he said, "Dear boy, we've been doing this for 20 years. The thing is that kind of outside, the world has been moving to data for a long time. And the nature of the standardization ecosystem is such that the things that make it really good tend to make it quite slow to change, because you protect what's good and you are nervous about what might be different. So we're not the most innovative organizations, although we do deal with very innovative subjects. It's a kind of an interesting kind of dichotomy at the end of the day. But everyone is moving, and the pace of change will accelerate. And what we can already see at the international level, that there are a number of database standards, for example, and we expect these to increase. There are also an increasing number of ontology standards, and the days when we publish those as documents has long past its useful life. There are several dozen of those. And there's about 1,000 vocabularies and taxonomies across a vast range of subjects. Again, their usefulness as documents is limited compared to their usefulness as data that can be exchanged between systems. And that kind of process is what we are expecting to apply to more and more standards content. So we can expect standards to move from being documents to being collections of things that work together to solve a problem. And so the transition that we're looking at the moment is moving from a document level to a clause level, or ideally a sentence level. So can we isolate individual provisions? And then ultimately those provisions may or may not then be treated as a data item. And what that means is that you'll be able to change or reference things very, very specifically. So the first thing is about referencing. The second is that you'll be able to collect things from different standards together, or from different domains together, and they will be consistent with each other, and they'll help you solve a problem. And that's because more and more problems. I know that you scoffed at my intersectionality, but more and more problems straddle different domains. They're not constrained by things anymore. To give you an example, one of my favorite new standards working its way through the ISO ecosystem is on the digital twin of feet. So there are, I think, 3 different standards going through on digital twins to do with shoe production. And you wouldn't have thought that cobblers were going to be the most innovative industry, but they are, because all of them are having to be. They're all having to develop new skills, new capabilities, new digital capabilities. And increasingly, we can expect there to be a drift towards, continued drift towards international standards, because of the globally connected supply chains and people needing to reference things in a very consistent way. But also, we can expect to see, probably more standards in emerging technologies being developed quicker, emerging, pardon the pun, quicker, because people will be more and more aware of the benefit that standardization can bring in an emerging market, because it's about helping you reduce unnecessary competition and unnecessary cost. We're all fighting, kind of enormous societal pressures, the pandemic, climate change, aging populations, antibiotic resistance, the move to smart cities, transport, mobility questions. All of these things need us to focus our attention on progress as quickly as possible. And standards accelerate that process when they're done right. And so that's what kind of I see as the future. Standards helping to solve these big problems. And my job is to make more people more aware of that problem, and make it easier for them to actually benefit.
I just wonder, as a final thought, Ivan, you've mentioned there that smart standards are the future in the sense of how they are developed and how they're used. I just wonder if you were crystal ball gazing, say in 50 years' time, whether we would recognise the standards making system in a sense. How you've described there some quite radical change. Will it be so different that we'll look back and think, wow, why did we ever do it that way? Would it be that different in 50 years' time?
Yes and no. So some standards are better set by a machine in future. So if we think of the example I normally give here is the evolution of the yard or the meter. So originally that was a physical object. It was literally a yard of metal, and then various things have happened over time, including one of the reference yards being melted down in a fire. That meant that it progressively changed from being a physical object that you could hold and touch and agree that it was the same and measure it against other ones, through to what it is now, in terms of I think it's something to do with the speed of light. I can't remember. I should have checked before I started on that anecdote, but I didn't realise I was going to make it.
Our top production team will be looking it up right now. Well, the top production team have come up trumps with some information on the meter. Now, the definition of the meter has changed over the years since the metric system was first introduced in 1793, though the actual length of the meter obviously has not changed. New definitions have been introduced to make it easier to measure the meter's length more precisely. The meter was originally defined in 1793 as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. The meter is currently defined as the length of the path travelled by light in a vacuum in 1/299,792,458 of a second. The current definition was adopted in 1983 and modified slightly in 2002. So, now you know.
The thing is, it's more accurate for it to be a kind of an abstract thing. And one of the things that will change is that some standards will be self-writing, if you like what I mean. They'll be autonomous. And that could be based on usage. You need to make this safer. And we're going to apply that as a, if you like, a software patch automatically. And all devices that are connected to this standard, quote unquote, will then have new parameters. And you can already see that actually in some of the things like the connected autonomous vehicles, where you can issue a software patch and some of the underlying capabilities change overnight. And we're all used to that with phones, and we're used to that with other forms of technology. So this isn't really a 50-year view, but some of these things will change quite quickly. But other things are not going to change at all, because ultimately, in deciding what is good, what is valuable, you need to make a judgment. And that judgment is based on expertise, and it's based on an understanding of the outside world. So I think we will always have a consensus process that is human-centric and increasingly ethics-driven, and potentially, and I would hope, also kind of problem-driven.
Now, Ivan, you've talked there about the pace of change, and it sounds as if things are actually moving really fast. But I wonder, given the fast pace of the world, and you've mentioned there about the global challenges we're all facing, I wonder, is the pace fast enough?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question in the standards ecosystem because of this market feedback loop that I mentioned earlier. That the existing revision cycle is typically 3 to 5 years, and that's the first we really get to know as to how a standard has worked or not. We obviously have some commercial indicators in the near term, but we don't really know kind of how it went down in the market for a number of years. So that does kind of create this inertia. And so what we really need is for the engineers of the future and the standards makers of the future and the standards users out there at the moment to, kind of get in touch with their standards bodies that they work with and really kind of demand the change that they need in order to make it relevant to them, to make it usable to them, to make it comparable and experienced to the other kinds of information products and systems that people use nowadays. I mean, ultimately, none of us want to become irrelevant by default through inaction. The standards world has a relatively unique position in society, but it does protect it sometimes from kind of necessary change, in my view. Obviously, my background is digital and open, so I have some biases. But anything that your listeners can do to badger people or provide evidence for change, and we can provide some contact details if people want to get in touch, so that's perfectly fine. That would be really helpful.
Yes, that's a fantastic suggestion there, Ivan. And the easiest way to get in touch is just drop an email to education@bsigroup.com and we'll take it from there. Now, earlier in our conversation, Ivan mentioned Katherine Hunter. I picked up the Future of Standards story with Katherine, and specifically on the issue of the new standard BSI Flex. But I started with asking her about her role for BSI in standard services.
So I work in the team standard services. We work on the development of new standards, particularly in areas where we don't already have established technical committees. So typically we would be looking at new areas of work for BSI, trying to understand what the particular problems and challenges are in those areas, trying to understand how a new standard might help, who might need to be involved in that standard, how does that new standard potentially link to other standards, and really scoping those new areas of work and bringing people in to work on those, sort of reaching out to stakeholders to build the groups of experts that we need to help us on standards development. And typically because they're new areas of work for BSI, they tend to be areas of innovation, is where most of our activity tends to be within my team.
Now, we jokingly say to people, we ask them whether they've been either whether they're steeped in standards or seduced by standards, because we're really keen on people's individual standards journeys. How did you get to this point? What's been your standards journey?
So my standards journey, at the outset, I would confess I'm probably steeped in standards. My standards journey started at university, actually, as part of the masters that I was studying. BS 7750 on environmental management systems was quite a critical part of that course. And standards have stayed with me ever since. So moving on from university into working for a B2B publisher where we helped people understand how to implement standards and get value from them. And then when I joined BSI, obviously standards became really integral. And I did a lot of work on new and interesting areas, for example, product carbon footprinting and greenhouse gas emissions. So I confess that I am steeped in standards.
Now, we interviewed David Bell, Director of Standards Policy here at BSI, way back in episode 4, I think it was. Corrections Corner here. It was actually episode 6, talking about stakeholder engagement. And David described himself as a lifer. So I think maybe that's maybe got to apply that term to you as well.
I suspect that might be the case, yeah.
Now, Katherine, we've invited you on here to talk about BSI Flex. Before we go any further, let's just hear a quick guide.
BSI's Flex standards provide a flexible way to develop consensus-based good practice that dynamically adapts to keep pace with fast-changing markets. Flex standards, known as BSI Flex for short, have 4 key elements. Flexible development. The scope and rate of change are market-driven. Rapid iteration. New versions can be created in just a few weeks. Responsive evolution. Dynamically adapts to the needs of the market over time. And finally, open consultation, focused on areas where consensus can be achieved quickly.
Now, we just heard there a short summary about what BSI Flex is, but I'm interested as to why is BSI Flex being developed? You know, what have been the drivers for this new approach?
So we did some research looking at particularly the new areas of innovation that we were working on to try and understand if our current standards capability was keeping pace with innovation. And it became very clear that with rapid adoption of new technologies, digital disruption, that really rapid pace of change, and actually the fact that change was also continuous, that really meant that our existing approaches to standards development couldn't keep pace. So one of the significant drivers for the development of BSI Flex was to develop an approach to standards development that allowed us to keep pace and to also develop standards on a much more iterative basis that really responded to that continuous change that we were seeing in those areas of innovation. So it was very much initially around innovation and supporting innovation. But interestingly, in the last year, we've also recognised that it gave us a fantastic way to respond to a sort of large and sudden shock, like a global pandemic, where there was a need to very rapidly develop guidance or specifications and be in a position to modify those at speed when new thinking emerged around, for example, safe working practices and COVID. So those are the 2 main drivers that we now recognise for the development of Flex.
Now, we've covered in previous podcasts, we've done spotlights on individual standards, whether they're British standards or international ones. And we've also covered PAS. I just wonder, with Flex, you know, what is the fundamental difference from other standards developed by BSI and the standards world? And how do you balance that speed of development with rigour? Yeah,
it's a really good question, because we were very conscious that we needed to be developing a new standard that was different and additive to our existing mechanisms that we have for standards development. And obviously we develop British standards, we contribute to the development of European and international standards, and we have BSI PAS as well. So we were very careful to outline the circumstances in which we might need to deploy something like BSI Flex. And we talk about a level of certainty and the maturity of knowledge that might exist around a particular subject area. Now, where you have got a high degree of certainty and where you've got a good level of maturity around what should be in a standard, a maturity of understanding about what should be within a standard, something like a British standard is absolutely perfect because it brings stability to that particular market. It's a good sort of longer term solution that isn't going to change rapidly, because actually where you've got that stability and knowledge, you need certainty to allow people to invest around systems and solutions to implement the standard and really get value from it. At the other end of the scale, where you're dealing with very low levels of certainty, typically in areas of innovation where thinking is still changing, where even the language that you're using to discuss that technology, is still evolving, you need a slightly different mechanism of standardization. So what we've tried to do is with Flex to cater for that end of the spectrum, which is very much about high levels of uncertainty. People are still really trying to understand what good practice is, and that good practice is changing rapidly. And then we have paths sort of between those two ends of the spectrum, where we typically use that for sort of for innovation where it's settled down a little bit. So we have these sort of spectrum of standards that we can use depending on what is happening within the market and the level of maturity and understanding within the market. Your second question was around how do you accommodate that rapid speed but retain the robustness? And this is such a key point for us, because in all of our research, the feedback we had was, yes, we want standards to be able to be developed at speed and to be flexible, but please don't undermine the credibility of them. Please make sure they are as robust. And so as well as trying to work at pace, we're trying to retain those core principles around consensus, stakeholder engagement, public consultation. We had such a clear signal from people we work with that consensus particularly was still critical. So we had to make sure that we could marry up that speed with all of those principles that we're known for in terms of standards development.
So we've talked in the past about PAS being a route to an international standard. I'm just wondering whether with the BSI Flex approach, I presume there's still a route to an international standard?
Yes, absolutely. In the same way as when we develop a PAS, we would work with a particular group of stakeholders. It may be a UK-based group of stakeholders. Once we've reached agreement, we can absolutely use the output from the Flex standard and the PAS standard as a basis for an international standard as well. And this has been a really interesting way of working in many subjects that we've covered, particularly some technology areas, whereby we've established a UK position quite quickly in a very responsive way and been able to use that as the basis of an international standard going forward. So yes, absolutely, both of these routes, the PAS and the Flex, can lead to international standards.
Now, you mentioned a second ago about developing the safe working guidelines in the light of obviously the global pandemic and COVID-19. I'm just wondering, in what other areas has this new approach been used so far?
So another area related to the pandemic, so Flex 5555 on community face coverings, is a very recent piece of work for us that we kicked off at the end of November, early December, with the first version of that standard being published in early January. Now, this is, again, it's a response to the need to move very quickly on an issue that's very much related to the current pandemic. We've all become really familiar with community face coverings. It's an essential part of our life now. And I think what was really needed was a robust specification that was suitable for the UK, so that manufacturers, testing houses, retailers and consumers could manufacture and test single-use and reusable face coverings. And I do have to point out, this is not PPE and not medical face coverings. It's the community face coverings that we all know and love. But what's really interesting about this is the timescales within which we work. So it was about a month for the first version to be produced. That has now been available for use, but critically also for further comment. And this is a key feature of Flex, is that we don't stop with that version. We continue to actively seek feedback on the current version in order to generate the next version. And that's where the flexibility comes in. So we've been asking, during January, we've been asking people for feedback on the current version. We've now reached the end of that period of consultation, and we're looking through the comments with a view to generating the next version fairly quickly. So that's the dynamic nature of this type of standardization, and it gives you a feel for the timescales that we're working with.
I mean, it may be hard for you to answer this question, but where do you anticipate the biggest areas of growth for this particular type of standard?
I think the two examples that I've mentioned are obviously related to the pandemic. If I just quickly mention another example, which I think is very much in the area where we would expect there to be growth. I mean, we're all hoping that we're coming out the other side of the global pandemic. So hopefully we don't need to deploy this method for too many more responses to that situation. But going back to our original plans, it was around innovation and around new technologies. And just to give you one example is the work we've been doing on connected and automated vehicles. So this is a fairly big piece of work that we're doing to look at standards to support the rollout of connected and autonomous vehicles. And it's all to do with a range of standards looking at design, testing and deployment, safety, and various aspects, data management, all sorts of things to do with connected and automated vehicles. And in common with any new area of standardization and new technology, there was initially a lack of a common language, a common way of a common and consistent way of defining some of the terms that are related to this particular area. So we have developed a Flex, which sits at the heart of that standardization program. And that Flex is a set of vocabulary that we've now produced 3 versions of over time to reflect the changing thinking, the very rapid changing thinking around a common set of terms for connected and automated vehicles. Now, that is very typical of where we envisage Flex would be useful, where you're trying to accommodate that rapid technological change. And so for me, I think that is typical of the area where we would expect to see growth going forward.
I'm glad you mentioned transport and mobility. It is something that we are going to feature in a future episode. Now, you talked at the beginning about, I asked you about balancing the speed of development with rigor in the standards development process. And I'm wondering, given that you managed to achieve that, will all standards eventually be made this way?
Well, there are certain aspects of the way that we work that are specific to Flex, and there are certain aspects in the way that we develop them that will be transferable to other standards. So some of the features of Flex, which I think will remain unique to Flex, are around the ability, when you're building consensus, if you can't agree on a particular area, you could park it for that version and then come back to it to the next version, because you know that you're going to have another opportunity to discuss it with the advisory group and agree on what should be in there. Some of the methods of working and the tools that we're using to really make that a rapid and agile process, I can absolutely see transferring over to other areas of standards development. So we're asking our advisory group to collaborate online on content development in real time. So they're commenting, they can see what everybody else is commenting, they can have discussions around the content in a far more interactive way. That way of working has a place across any type of standards development. That's not unique to Flex. But there are some aspects of Flex which are very specific to Flex itself. And that's really around that iterative nature, I think.
Now, Katherine, we talk on the podcast a lot about standards being an international game. And as a final thought then, I'm wondering, what are the views of the rest of the standards community to BSI Flex?
Well, I think that there is wide recognition that we're all dealing with the same problem and the same challenge. We have obviously spoken to other people engaged in standards development, other national standards bodies, to share our experience and to learn from everybody else's experience. We haven't had specific feedback on Flex at this stage, but we're really interested to share what we've learnt and to learn from others, because I think in the spirit of Flex, which is all about continuing to accommodate rapid change, we will be continuing to evolve our approach on Flex as we learn more, as new tools become available, as we share knowledge with others, facing the same challenge and learn from how they are addressing that challenge as well.
To find out more information on BSI Flex, just click on the link in the episode notes.
You have been listening to an episode of the BSI Education Podcast. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/education.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.